Welcome to today's webinar on combating corruption capably in parliamentary democracies. This webinar is part of the OECD 2021 Anti-Corruption and Integrity Forum, and WFD is pleased to be a knowledge partner for this event. On the practical side, and as is the case in other Zoom webinars, you can write questions in the Q&A box. Please indicate to whom your question is directed, and you might also write your questions as the webinar unfolds. We hope to have sufficient time for questions as this webinar is scheduled for 1 hour and 15 minutes. Before I will make a couple of introduction remarks, I want to introduce our excellent panel today. We are pleased that we will have Meg Hillier with us here. She is a member of the UK House of Commons since 2005. She has been a minister in government and is currently the chairperson of the Public Accounts Committee, where she is leading groundbreaking oversight inquiries, including on COVID-related issues. She will join us in the second part of the webinar as she is currently, while we are speaking, participating in a sitting of Parliament. Luca Glusak is a researcher specialized in independent oversight bodies. He has joined DCAF, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, in 2020, where he coordinates the Ombuds program. He's a research fellow at University of Belgrade, and previously he was a senior advisor to the Ombudsperson institution in Serbia and a fellow at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. Geoff Dubrow specializes in strengthening the nexus between parliamentary oversight and public financial management. Geoff's focus includes strengthening fiscal and debt transparency, as well as providing capacity development to parliamentary committees related to oversight of the budget process. Recently, Geoff authored WFD's policy brief on the role of Parliament in public debt management. And Geoff has also authored a financial accountability series, which he will talk about today, joining us from Canada. And at the start of this panel, I'd like to elaborate about the context of our debate today. We will speak about how parliamentary democracies and parliaments can contribute to combating corruption. And we are speaking here about full-fledged democracies as well as struggling democracies. And we see that there are more and more struggling democracies. There is a democratic decline. And here are a couple of facts from the VDEM recent report on the state of democracy. Autocracies are home to 68% of the world population in over 87 countries. Liberal democracies diminished over the past decade from 41 countries to 32, with a population share currently of only 14%. And the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in 2020 is down to the levels last found around 1989, which is the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we see an increase in authoritarian regimes, countries which are not democratizing, but de-democratizing, which are sliding back in terms of democracy. So whether a country is democratic or not is not a fixed or a stable issue, but it's evolving and often in a very profound way. So in de-democratizing countries, the opposition is stifled. Institutions of checks and balances are rolled back. And most of the de-democratizing countries have elected populist leaders. And these illiberal leaders are threatening the democratic institutions and norms. Now, this has consequences for anti-corruption efforts, and the consequences are severe. Traditional governance-focused reforms are rolled back, and illiberal leaders are weaponizing anti-corruption in their power grab. State institutions like anti-corruption commissions and tax authorities are being abused to cripple the opposition. And so in this difficult context, we are looking at anti-corruption policies and institutions. And some of these countries have built anti-corruption agencies over the years. There are currently over 150 anti-corruption agencies around the world, most of them established over the past 25 to 30 years. And while an anti-corruption agency can initially be established in the context of a society becoming more democratic, it might now find itself in a context where the country becomes more authoritarian. So we see the proliferation of populist and nationalist leaders, and that has expanded opportunities for corruption within states. Ethical rules and anti-corruption legislation are loosened. For instance, the Russian Duma is currently debating draft legislation enabling so-called accidental corruption, meaning when they are in the context of, for instance, a pandemic or a natural disaster, there won't be prosecution for issues otherwise considered corruption or collusion of interests. So in the context of democratic backsliding, some leaders are looking to subvert democracy and are increasingly weaponizing anti-corruption campaigns to harass and suppress opposition candidates and movements. Opposition politicians are then targeted under fraud allegations filed by the authorities. And so hence it is becoming clearer that for anti-corruption initiatives to be successful and to be truly targeting corruption, the state of democracy matters. It does make a difference when anti-corruption initiatives take place in a democratic system of governance or not. And therefore, anti-corruption needs to be aligned with a broader democratization agenda to be strategic and effective. And corruption can be viewed as an intensely political phenomenon with the response crafted accordingly. So hence, this is why we speak today about parliaments, democracy, and anti-corruption, and why we will speak about which are the instruments at hand in a parliamentary democracy, which are the accountability institutions, the institutional framework for bringing accountability and integrity in a democratic system of governance. And so that's the first issue I wanted to raise at the start of our panel today. And the second contextual issue I want to raise is that corruption and anti-corruption are not just a national phenomenon or a domestic issue within the borders of a country. We are speaking about international networks of corruption, tax evasion, illicit financial flows, and organized crime. And the Panama Papers and the FinCEN files have exposed the secret documents about how banks and regulators have allowed dirty money to flow unchecked around the globe, and how some political leaders and businessmen could benefit from secretive offshore tax regimes. Now, as the corruption and kleptocracy are international, the response needs to be international as well. And there is a rapidly growing international anti-corruption agenda emerging and gaining traction. Front and center are President Biden and his administration gearing up to make battling corruption a key and quite innovative part of US foreign policy. President Biden and his team argue that corruption is a growing menace, not only to the ordinary citizens, but to democracy itself. And they speak of it with a sense of urgency. A growing number of other governments are waking up to the threat posed by corruption, partly because of the rise of protest movements, highlighting popular anger over such malpractices. President Biden has pledged to host an international summit for democracy in the coming months, and the need to fight corruption is expected to be a major theme during that gathering. It's interesting to note that corruption is no longer viewed as simply a law enforcement issue, or one that affects only developing countries or captured states. If anything, I think in recent years, reports such as the Panama Papers and the FinCEN files show that established democracies, through their often weak financial rules, have allowed the problem getting out of control to the point where it's becoming a security threat. Now, there are signs that other countries are waking up to the magnitude of the challenge. And in June of this year, in a couple of months, United Nations General Assembly will hold its first ever special session focused on corruption. Further on, anti-corruption advocates are pushing to make corruption an agenda item during other summits in the coming months, such as the G7 and the G20 meetings, as well as the Summit of the Americas, which the US is planning to host later this year. So a lot is moving in the area of anti-corruption. And the massive response and participation in today's panel and in the entire OECD Anti-Corruption Forum this week is also testimony to the fast building interest in the way how democracies fight back for core principles of accountability. And so the third and my concluding remark is specifically about the role of parliaments within a democratic system of governance in combating corruption, and how parliaments can play a meaningful role in anti-corruption. I have one slide to show on this issue. And on this slide, we have the building blocks for Parliament's role in combating corruption. So I believe we will now see the slide with the different building blocks. And the first one is around performing parliamentary oversight role effectively, questioning policies, hold government to account, closely watching the execution of the state budget, keeping under review the functioning and the budget of state-owned or public enterprises. The second building block is a rule of law system, which is independent and which has also a conviction rate of corruption cases, which is solid. And for instance, in Ukraine, we see a struggle in securing a functional legal system, for instance, in terms of the development of a specific anti-corruption prosecution office. The third one is establishing a functioning relationship between Parliament and independent oversight institutions, such as audit institutions and anti-corruption agencies. And that is the issue on which we will talk, Luca and Geoff, later today. The fourth, when we look at specific pillars, I think enacting integrity legislation related to transparency, income and asset declaration for public officials and MPs, conflict of interest, employment restrictions, the issue of revolving doors, a transparent system of remuneration for MPs and code of conduct for the members of parliament. These are key issues around integrity legislation and policies. We also have an important pillar in anti-bribery and money laundering legislation. And some of you might know that 10 years ago, the UK Parliament adopted its Bribery Act, which made progress in important areas such as its extraterritorial reach and corporate criminal liability for corruption offences. Many other countries have adopted their own bribery legislation, and a lot can be learned from that as well. And the sixth one is around corruption proofing of significant bills. So that means identifying the corruption risks in legislation and in the legislative review process. And then we have the framework about politics and political parties. So here it's about establishing pluralistic and inclusive politics and working with politicians in identifying one of the main drivers of corruption, about how politicians themselves are expected to take charge of the cost of politics. We have the issue of providing Parliament's opportunity to provide input to the national anti-corruption strategy and contribute to the process of drafting and monitoring the implementation. And finally, because combating corruption is an international issue, engaging with other parliaments as well as with civil society involved in anti-corruption, transparency and integrity. So with this introduction, I wanted to give, to open our panel and start the first discussion on the relationship between two key institutions in the accountability system, parliaments and anti-corruption agencies. And as mentioned, there are over 150 anti-corruption agencies globally, often established by legislation adopted by parliament. So how do these two institutions relate to each other? That will be the topic for our first panel member, Luca Glusak, who has published extensively on this subject matter. Luca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Franklin. And I would like also to thank OECD and WFD for organizing this event and providing us actually with the opportunity to discuss this nexus between Parliament and specialized bodies in charge of making sure that the public funds and resources are used in a proper way. As someone, as you said, who is specialized in the institutional design of independent oversight bodies, especially ombuds institutions and anti-corruption agencies, as well as their relationship with the legislature, let me be, perfectly honest at the very beginning. Impeccably designed institution is like a perpetuum mobile. It's impossible because the letter and the spirit of the law are never perfectly translated into practice. However, that does not mean that we should not aim for most perfect institutional design, most perfect legislation, as there both the foundation and the caryatids of a solid institution. They are necessary preconditions for any institutions, particularly those with oversight mandates. They're particularly important for those with oversight mandates because such bodies are essential extended arms of parliaments. And so-called fourth branch of power has been created to help re-establishing the balance, that equilibrium between three branches of power, which has been distorted in favor of the executive in many countries in the last decades. But parliaments are there not only to establish independent oversight bodies through legislation, but also they're also responsible for making sure that these bodies are given real fighting chances in terms of strong mandate, guarantees of independence, and optimal resources. So in a practical realm, Parliament should protect oversight bodies, including anti-corruption agencies, from undue influence on one side, but also to keep them accountable on the other. So those two have to go together and have to be in balance. Because if you provide an anti-corruption agency with a strong mandate, particularly with law enforcement and prosecution powers, but you do not envisage the control mechanisms, you essentially end up with a loose cannon. And on the other side, if you provide anti-corruption agency with a strong mandate, but without the real ability and capacity to execute such mandate, we have essentially a paper tiger. So as Franklin said there, today we have more than 150 specialized anti-corruption agencies in the world. And indeed, in some instances, anti-corruption agencies, ACAs, have been a real disappointment, to be honest, and their effectiveness has been questioned because they have been perceived as paper tigers. Because nobody wants to invest time and money and end up with a paper tiger. But at the same time, governments want to avoid having a loose cannon. So essentially, we are aiming at something in between. For the last 2 years, and Franklin and I have been trying to come up with the criteria and indicators that will help us to define the relationship between parliaments and anti-corruption agencies in a measurable way, because this nexus is of particular importance for the overall anti-corruption system in a state. So we have provided for the assessment framework, which incorporates the necessary level of independence granted to ACAs, as well as the accountability demanded from them. So in other words, our assessment framework is built around the central argument that it is Parliament's responsibility to make sure that the ACA's decisions and key concerns are raised properly and properly followed up. But also we are aiming to define and secure both normative and financial preconditions for the ACA's work. So this should ensure the conducive context for the success of anti-corruption agencies, by ensuring that also other parts of the state system are not effectively frustrating the work of anti-corruption agencies. So we have come up with 5 basic criteria that illuminate whether a parliament performs these responsibilities in a proper manner. At the same time, we are fully mindful of different types of ACAs, and most commonly used categorization is that of OECD, which differentiate multi-purpose agencies, so with law enforcement powers, and then those anti-corruption agencies with exclusively law enforcement mandate. And finally, the third type are so-called prevention policy and coordination institutions. Let me quickly go through our 5 criteria that should help us to assess the relationship between Parliament and ACAs. So the first one is the Parliament's role in establishing the legal framework and mandate of the ACA. Here we are looking at whether an ACA has been established by Parliament-approved legislation. It guarantees its independence, a clear and strong mandate, the strength of institutional objectives, and also clear regulation of its relations with the other state and public authorities. Obviously, the strongest guarantees of independence and institutional resilience are provided if anti-corruption agency is a constitutionally ranked body, as it is the case, for example, in the Maldives. A second best solution, obviously, is the establishment by the law. So, for instance, a National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine is established by the law as an independent body created to exclusively tackle high-level corruption. But contrary to the Anti-Corruption Commission of the Maldives, Ukrainian NABU is a state law enforcement agency. So we have that examples of two different types of anti-corruption agencies. However, it should be underlined that the anti-corruption agencies are only one element of the bigger and wider anti-corruption system. So they're not panacea, they cannot stop corruption on their own. So one of the most critical stages for the ultimate success of anti-corruption efforts is when the case is transferred from anti-corruption agency to prosecution and the court. And in many countries, the main problem has been the lack of properly functioning judicial system that will try high-profile anti-corruption cases. Let me again maybe use the case of Ukraine, which is quite illustrative. For example, by spring 2020, NABU, Ukrainian ACA, in cooperation with a specialized anti-corruption prosecutor's office, has initiated 900 pre-trial investigations in high-level corruption cases. However, only 40 cases out of those 900 have been concluded with a conviction. And that is obviously has been noted by many actors, including European Commission, which noted that the vast majority of those cases were blocked in Ukrainian ordinary courts. So to remedy this, a high anti-corruption court has been established with exclusive jurisdiction over the high-profile corruption cases. And there are indeed great expectations of this new specialized court, which is widely perceived as a missing link that would guarantee that the NABU cases receive proper and efficient judicial follow-up. The second criteria in our assessment framework is Parliament's role in the selection, appointment, and removal of the leadership of the ACA. So as in any other organization, leadership plays a crucial role in the success, but the leaders must not only assume the traditional roles of managers and public spokespersons of their institutions, but also maintain the confidence of citizens that their rights and interests are indeed being protected. So therefore, the head of ACA needs to be selected according to the procedures which are, strengthening to the highest possible extent the authority, impartiality, independence, and legitimacy of the anti-corruption agency. However, out of all our 5 criteria, the practice shows that the good formal procedures are easiest stultified when it comes to the selection and appointment of the ACA leadership. Vetting procedures or pre-selections performed by either standing or ad hoc, parliamentary or mixed commissions are often used actually to get rid of the good candidates in an early stage of the recruitment, particularly those who are not favorites of the ruling majority. Thus, political opposition, the media, the civil society have to follow this stage particularly carefully, insisting on merit, transparent, and open recruitment process. The third criterion that we took under consideration is parliamentary role regarding resources allocated to the ACA. Because, if you have a strong mandate, but without a real means to perform it and to exercise it, it's necessary that we look more in more detail in the role of Parliament in allocating resources for the ACA operations, and I mean the resources that are sufficient for it to exercise its functions, as well as making sure that resources are used properly. A good example in comparative practice is Montenegro, where the law on prevention of corruption provides for very strong guarantees of financial independence of the Agency for Prevention of Corruption. The law stipulates that the fund of the work of the agency are provided in the state budget. The agency proposes its own draft budget, submits it directly to the Parliament. And it is also one of rare examples where the law stipulates that the approved amount, so the approved budget for the work of the ACA must not amount less than 0.2% of the entire current budget, which is also strong and good provision. Also, it is important to include in legislation that upon the approval of the state budget in the Parliament, the anti-corruption agencies can decide independently on the use of funds allocated to it. So without the daily interference of the government, and that is also important guarantee of operational independence. The four criteria that we have come up as a very important one is Parliament's consideration of and follow-up to annual and other reports of the anti-corruption agency, because these reports are an important part of, on one side, of the accountability of the anti-corruption agencies towards the Parliament, but they also serve to inform the Parliament and the general public about anti-corruption agencies' work and the key developments in anti-corruption efforts. So through following up to the reports of the ACAs, parliaments could actually exercise their own oversight function over the executive. However, this opportunity is rarely used by the Parliament. So comparatively looking, this is probably at least the least developed criteria. There are problems both in legislation and its implementation. So for example, let me use, for example, the case of Ukraine again, just for the consistency. In Ukraine, the law provides for a very detailed provision on the content of the ACA annual report, but then it is almost completely silent on the follow-up procedure in the Parliament. On the other hand, in Serbia, parliamentary rules of procedure contain detailed and well-designed provisions on the follow-up to the ACA report, but then this provisions and this procedure is not used in practice. Reports are rarely discussed, mostly usually in a formal way and without any meaningful results. And finally, in some jurisdictions, such as in Pakistan, the legislation is completely silent on the follow-up procedure. So we have, both problems in legislation and obviously then as a natural consequence in the practice as well. So with this, three examples, we have three different legal situations, but with the same practical results and the bad results. Besides these four criteria, we have also included the fifth one to assess Parliament's cooperation with ACAs on policy and awareness raising issues. This criterion can be understood as an additional one because it remains almost obsolete in a situation where those prior four, let me call them essential criteria, are not fulfilled. But with these five criteria put together, I think we have a rather comprehensive framework to understand the relationship between parliaments and ACAs, both de jure and de facto. However, with the, as it is the case with a similar assessment exercises, this assessment framework serves to assist the establishment of, baseline and key benchmarks, but it is very important to take into account the specific local context, because informal practices and customs elude any formal framework. So, we urge, the users to contextualize, their assessment within the wider political, cultural, social, and legal processes, and also take account the stage of democratic development of a given country. Just before I conclude, I have one final note regarding the process of many politicians coming to power. Many politicians rise to power is based on anti-corruption platforms, on claims that they will rectify decades of endemic corruption, on promises of a different approach to public service, and so on. So in such circumstances, quite often one of the first actions they take once in power is to establish anti-corruption agency. However, not really these agencies are given weak, only advisory mandates, and they serve more as a marketing tools than real investigative machines. So establishing independent anti-corruption agency with strong investigative powers is actually the best evidence of a real determination to tackle deep-seated corruption problems. And I think that especially, media, civil society, and especially, epistemic communities in countries, especially in transitional phase, should insist of having strong anti-corruption agencies. So I think this is all I have had in mind for this opening intervention. Thank you for your attention, and yeah, I'm more than looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca, for this introduction. Indeed, very insightful. You mentioned the different types of anti-corruption agencies, but also that anti-corruption agency is only one of the actors in a broader institutional field. And you referred, for instance, to the issue of the conviction rate. You also mentioned the importance not just to look at legislation, but how it actually works out in practice, how it is applied, and then indeed the 5 criteria on assessing this relationship between Parliament and anti-corruption agencies are very useful, because it enables Parliament to develop a constructive relationship with anti-corruption agencies, while at the same time being a kind of the guardian of their independence and their effectiveness as well. So I'm sure that probably some of the people in the audience will already start drafting some questions, so we'll keep that for in a bit. Our next contribution will be by Geoff Dubrow. He will speak about the role of one of the other independent oversight institutions, which are the Supreme Audit institutions. And he has recently published a policy brief under the interesting title, "Are Supreme Audit Institutions Still Fit for Purpose in Times of COVID-19?" Geoff, the floor is yours. And you're muted.
Thank you so much, Franklin. And just before I forget, I'll just hit the button here so that you have access to the link for that brief that you just made reference to. Very interesting to hear from Luca, and similarly, I want to just express my thanks to WFD for the opportunity to appear on this panel, and to the OECD for organizing this event. So I have some slides that I thought I would use just to help illustrate and guide the presentation. Let me just talk a bit about what I had in mind for the next 15 minutes. If you just go to the next slide. So I'll talk to you a bit about Supreme Audit institutions in the Westminster parliamentary system. I'll make references to other models as well, such as the Cour des Comptes, but I will talk to you about mostly about the SAIs in countries that have taken on the Westminster system, like for example, like Ghana, Kenya, and others. We'll talk briefly about the role of SAIs in combating corruption or addressing corruption. And then I'll get to the topic that Franklin made reference to, which is what do SAIs need to do to be fit for purpose in the era of COVID-19 and beyond? And then I'll talk briefly about what needs to change. So that's what I had in mind for the next 14 minutes or so. If you can flip over to the next slide. So let me just, for those of you who are not specialists, just as I am not a specialist at anti-corruption agencies, so I appreciated very much the briefing by Luca. For those of you who are not specialists in working with Supreme Audit institutions, let me just give you a little bit of background. It's a very intimidating title, of course, Supreme Audit Institution, but it really is the apex level external audit body, which is supposed to be independent of government. So distinct from the internal audit function, which would be something you would find in government as a government body, Supreme Audit institutions are supposed to be external, outside auditors. In that way, they are one of the last, if not the last, line of defense in terms of ensuring good governance and integrity in the system. If you look at the two bottom boxes, you'll see that the Supreme Audit Institution is really there to conduct a series of audits. That is, they audit financial statements to ensure that they are have been presented in a fair manner in compliance with international standards. And they conduct regulatory or compliance audits, which really look at whether funds have been spent for the purposes intended by Parliament. And that, of course, is a very big area where regulatory audits tend to be the area that are most relevant when it comes to issues of corruption. SAIs also perform value for money or performance audits, which look at whether the government has spent funds with due regard to economy and efficiency and sometimes effectiveness. And we'll talk a bit about that a little bit more. I won't take you through the whole chart, but I do want to make mention of the fact that you'll notice that the main recourse that SAIs have is to report their findings to Parliament in the Westminster system, unlike the Court of Accounts system, which has its own quasi-judicial enforcement powers. Really all a Supreme Audit institution in the Westminster system can do is report to Parliament. So it's really incumbent on Parliament to act on the findings of the Supreme Audit institution. Now, having said that, in areas of corruption in which the SAI conducts a forensic audit or identifies corruption, those findings can certainly be handed over to the prosecutor for prosecution. But generally, those are the exceptions. And so this model does have it can be problematic. And we'll talk in a few minutes about how Ghana and other countries in Africa have adopted this model to be able to deal more with the lack of enforcement that is so prevalent in this particular model. So we can go on to the next slide. Just to position very quickly, I think Franklin may have mentioned organizations of horizontal accountability, that SAIs, just like anti-corruption agencies, are state actors, regardless of the fact that they're supposed to be independent, but they are mandated to have the formal authority to demand explanations or impose penalties. They are oversight bodies. And so SAIs are, just to position them, are an agency of horizontal accountability. I do want to stress the importance, and when I talk about Ghana in a moment, I'll give you an example of the importance of civil society, but vertical accountability, I think, is also important. And I'll be very honest that as a practitioner who specializes in working with Parliament, often I don't spend enough time or pay enough attention to the role of civil society. We tend to get focused on parliamentary mechanisms, but often it is civil society organizations in the vertical accountability process that are the ones that are pushing Parliament or pushing the SAIs to go further, to get out of their comfort zones. And so I think it's just important to make mention of that. If we can go on to the next slide. With respect to the role of SAIs in combating corruption, there's really three: prevention, detection, and enforcement. The reality, however, is that really SAIs spend most of their time in the detection phase, and that is conducting regulatory or compliance audits, which are really, according to the Lima Declaration, they are deviations from accepted standards and violations of legality and financial management. So if you look at an audit report from a lower middle income country, the regulatory audit reports tend to be very voluminous documents that go through in extensive detail a series of transactions, one after the other, from different departments, ministries, departments, and agencies. And there will be, that is a way of detecting misuse of spending, because again, this is all about whether funds have been spent for the purposes intended by Parliament. Forensic audit is, of course, another tool that Supreme Audit institutions have at their disposal, and they are constantly working to shore up their capacity in this regard, particularly in countries which are highly prone to corruption. So detection is very important. If I back up one step and I look at prevention, yes, it is true that SAIs do play a role in prevention. In fact, if you just skip over to the next slide for a second, I'll just talk a bit about what some of those roles are in terms of prevention, and then I'll flip back. Franklin knows that I like to flip around a lot in my slides, which I try not to do too much of. So it's important to emphasize that SAIs can certainly promote sound financial management practices and encourage robust internal control mechanisms. And by internal control, I mean that government has its own public financial management processes in place to be able to catch transactions that are illicit or that are not in compliance with the purposes intended by Parliament. So these have to be based on effective financial reporting. They can encourage governments to strengthen their internal control systems and closely monitor areas prone to corruption. If you go back to the previous slide for a second. But again, this is ultimately, this is the government's responsibility. And so in a financial audit, often Supreme Audit institutions will test the internal controls. They will see whether the processes are actually in place to catch these types of transactions. So they'll also look at the internal audit function and see what controls are in place and whether the internal audit function is working effectively. Unfortunately, this is where I think we haven't seen much change since I started working with Supreme Audit institutions about 20 years ago. And we'll see this in a quote from the latest PIFA, or the first PIFA global report, which explains that really internal control systems in government continue to be very weak. And in one middle income or lower middle income country that I was working in, the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, who was a former minister, told me that often internal control systems are weak because government, specifically elected officials, don't want to have a strong internal control systems because this is going to deter corruption. So again, SAIs can play a role in testing internal control systems, but it's really up to the government to have those strong internal controls and strong public financial management practices. How are we doing for time? Okay. Enforcement is rare in the Westminster tradition. If you go to the high income countries like Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, and others, there really is no time spent on the question of enforcement, partly because corruption levels are much lower than other countries. And so in Canada, for example, the Auditor General will simply hand over a prosecution case a corruption case to the prosecution, and that will be the end of it. Having said that, though, there is an innovative function that has come up or has been developed in many low and middle income countries, which is that some Supreme Audit institutions that follow the Westminster tradition, like Ghana, have a power of disallowance and surcharge. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that particular enforcement power now. And this is specifically an adaptation. When I was doing workshops with Supreme Audit institutions and public accounts committees, particularly in this particular case in Africa, there really was a sense that the system that exists, the Westminster system, with the reliance on Parliament, simply wasn't sufficient. It was a good system, but there needed to be more. And so they started to explore other possible innovations. If you go to the next slide, I'll talk to you a bit about, next one. Lovely. So this is something that was published from Ghana regarding the surcharge and disallowance powers. And really what disallowance is it allows the audit office, the Ghana Audit Service, to put a stop on expenditures before they're paid, even if a contract has been entered into. There's also the power of surcharge, which means that even if the funds are already paid, the service, the audit office can, through a procedure, order the funds to be repaid. So this is a departure from what you would sort of see as the traditional nuts and bolts Westminster audit function, but it's also a very necessary one. And you see this in other countries in the region that have also adapted these powers. Now, of course, there are challenges. And as you see from this article, what's interesting about this particular instance is that the surcharge power and disallowance power have been underused by the Ghana Audit Service over the years, since 2000, since it was adopted. And one of the reasons for that is because it needs to withstand with appeals. As makes sense as part of due process, people who have been surcharged can actually appeal in court. And so you need to have, the audit service has to have a strong body of evidence collected. And as you can imagine, this is yet another demand on a very overburdened Supreme Audit institution. So it's only very recently that they've started to use this power again, the power of disallowance and surcharge. And what's interesting is that there's an NGO called a pressure organization called Occupy Ghana, which has been pushing for the Ghana Audit Service to use this power. So again, it's interesting to see that we can talk about state institutions and their roles, but it's often the NGO sector that's really pushing because we don't know what kind of pressures the audit office is getting not to use these powers. I'm speaking generically, not about Ghana in particular. So it's interesting to see an NGO come in and push for this and push them outside, a little bit outside their comfort zone. I think the other thing I would mention also, though, is that the surcharge power, one of the disadvantages of it is, of course, it puts the audit office in a fairly antagonistic light, in that it forces them to play a confrontational role by definition. And one of the issues I think one of the objectives in moving audit offices from compliance to more systemic performance audit, as we'll talk about in a moment, one of the issues regarding that is that performance auditors are supposed to appear to be there to help the department improve their operations. And so if they're forced to take a more legalistic approach, this can also make it more difficult to be trusted when it comes to conducting performance audits. So there are pluses and minuses to every approach. If you go to the next slide, and I'm cognizant that I only have a few minutes left, this is just a little bit of an excerpt from the brief, our Supreme Audit Institutions Fit for Purpose, that was authored for WFD. And let's just have a look at what are some of the things that SAIs need to do to be fit for purpose. If you go to the next slide. One is they need to rebalance their audit portfolios and shift resources away from compliance towards performance audit. Next, they need to adopt a more holistic approach in which compliance and regulatory audits contribute to identifying systemic weaknesses. I spent quite a bit of my career doing training for Supreme Audit institutions, particularly, as I mentioned, in Africa, but also in the Caribbean. And one of the challenges for compliance auditors is they're really there to see, they're really trained to see whether whether a transaction has complied or not complied with rules and regulations. And once they have that finding, they're pretty much done and move on to the next transaction. So as we'll see in a moment, it's really important to be able to identify more systemic weaknesses like the internal controls that we talked about. Number 3, they need to reflect more on societal impact by obtaining feedback on the usefulness of their reports. And number 4, they need to align their resources to tracking and reporting on the implementation of national priorities. So this really means things like, could certainly be, even though it's not something that gets discussed a lot, it could certainly be internal control systems within government to curb corruption. But it also pertains to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, improving public financial management, the oversight of public debt, and certainly the government's COVID-19 response. The more the government is that SAIs are stuck in the level of detail, the harder it is for them to look at some of these big picture items. And I think that's really one of the major drawbacks of Supreme Audit institutions today. What has to change? Just one slide on that, if you go to the next slide. This came right out of the last, I think it may have been the first global report that the PIFA did on global financial management. And they said that internal audit, management of fiscal risks, and scrutiny by SAIs and the legislature remains the weakest areas of public financial management. So while the Supreme Audit Institution continues to play the role of the internal audit department by going through the books, by auditing every transaction, it will be very, very difficult for them to step away from that micro role to look at the larger picture. And I think that's really what the challenge is for Supreme Audit institutions in the 21st century and beyond. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time, and look forward to hearing the next presenter and to some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoff, for this introduction, and fascinating to hear about the innovative practices, for instance, of the Ghana Audit Service about surcharge and disallowance powers. That's quite something. And also to hear about how Supreme Audit institutions can take an approach from compliance auditing to looking at more systemic or systematic weaknesses and issues in the financial accountability system. So thank you very much for that. I'm sure there might be some questions on that. Now I would like to welcome Ms. Meg Hillier, who is the chair of the Public Accounts Committee. We are very pleased that you're with us and that you can join us despite, I know, a very busy agenda. Ms. Meg Hillier is a member of the UK House of Commons since 2005. So that means a wealth of knowledge and experience. And this past year under COVID has been challenging for all of us. And so we are very curious hearing how the Public Accounts Committee dealt with the situation in bringing accountability to the systems of governance here in the UK. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'm only very sorry that I've been unable to hear the previous presentations. I had just put in for a debate which got called today, just the way that parliaments work. We will have to, and with Zoom now we can literally, well, I was there in person, but we can do 3 things at once apparently. So, thank you for your forbearance. I'm really still pleased to be able to contribute, and hopefully if I can be relatively brief, I'm very happy to take any questions if at all. And it was interesting just hearing up the end of Geoff's comments there about the role of our Supreme Audit Organisation. So the Public Accounts Committee in the UK has 16 members of Parliament, cross-party. I chair it as a member of the opposition, of course, as in many countries. And we work very closely with our National Audit Office, the UK National Audit Office. And what was apparent at the beginning of COVID was how fast it hit, how none of us expected the ramping up of billions and billions of pounds, now over 400 billion in the UK, to go. But from an early stage, I was being asked about what should happen with government departments and their way of reporting, how they should report their accounts that year. Because in that first week, they were seeking ministerial directions in order to spend any money on COVID, because of course we had a week to go before the end of the financial year. So we were immediately in an unprecedented territory. There was some hints that a department, I never quite remember which one, was suggesting they didn't have an annual accounting process this year, but they rolled 2 together. Anyway, I made sure that I put in my views, the views of my committee very firmly, that we wanted to see proper accounting processes. So going, to those financial processes firmly in place so that we could have clear tracking of expenditure by departments year on year. And you could then allow for the COVID spend. What we didn't want to see is COVID smother the normal processes so that we can actually keep a track. So we were very clear about that. And at some points, I think someone said to me, you shouldn't be counting beans. We're counting, people are counting bodies. What are you thinking of doing? I said, we will be pleased. We kept an eye on the money, because that is vitally important. And so it has proven, because we've seen a number of government initiatives, I think probably the truth across the world, some which have worked better than others. What has been really noticeable is that there has been much less normal controls. Well, so in the UK Parliament, we have a 2015 Act which allows governments to procure outside the normal rules in an emergency. So that's without normal tendering processes. So that's perfectly justified. As I keep reminding sometimes my own colleagues on the opposition, that was allowed. We also passed the very large Coronavirus Act, which gave government again license to act without constantly returning to Parliament, and license to let contracts further without tendering. Now that was fine, but I did expect that government would act. We gave them, as I put it, permission to act fast, but not to act fast and loose with taxpayers' money. And to our amazement, I think I would speak for some, our national audit body auditors can't speak for themselves in this sense, but I think we're all pretty shocked, politicians and auditors, at how slack things got in terms of recording key decisions about where billions of money was going. So we had the procurement of personal protective equipment with a lot. Now that was a global market. It was a challenge the world over. So we gave some leeway in those first couple of weeks, but there were decisions made about which businesses would win large lucrative contracts very little recording of why those companies were chosen over others. Incredibly, we had a VIP lane. This was recommendations from certain routes, including MPs, that would, and one in 10 of those was secured a contract. Now, what is extraordinary about that is, for those of you who are not politicians, when you're a busy member of parliament, you'll get a lot of people writing in saying that their company or their business or they can personally solve a problem of government. Quite often, if you're not, you can't assess that entirely as a constituency level. So the route would be quite often to pass it through to the minister to say, someone suggested this. I had one where the breathless young new member of staff said, somebody is going to visit their cousin in India and they will be able to sort out the PPE requirements for half of London. I said, I think we might want to refer them through the website where there's a portal. They have to record certain basic information, but some did circumvent that and go through to the minister, and 1 in 10 of those got a good contract. And there was no real record of why those decisions were made, and why there was assumption that recommendations through that route were going to be more credible. Some were, perhaps, but a lot were not. We also saw a lot of middle people, so, putting themselves between the market and the British government and making enough money to buy very nice estates in nice parts of the UK, cash purchases. So these are millions of pounds that individuals made, again, with little recording. And we have been improving the way we procure in the UK. Whitehall's got better at it, but this showed some real weaknesses. We've also seen a lack of recording lack of publication of contracts. These were being published very late in the day. And frankly, this is something, again, that it's fueling anybody who's saying that things are being done improperly by not doing it properly. And so I really can't understand why on some of these things, which would have been quite straightforward to publish a contract on time, the government is still being very defensive about it was just too busy to do it. Well, it's not that difficult to put a contract up 90 days after the contract was signed. And we've also seeing an opacity around the spending of, we've got test, track and trace, or test and trace, NHS test and trace, which has so far been allocated £37 billion, but when we've tried to drill down to exactly what it's achieving for that, that's been very difficult to do. One of the things that's been very, very helpful for us in the UK is that the now national audit body, the National Audit Office, decided to early on keep a track of the money that government was announcing. And so it has a cost tracker on its website, which is incredibly simple. It's not difficult, but it's amazing how there isn't really anywhere else you can get that information. So something as simple as counting the money as it's being announced and going out the door, not yet assessed at how well it's been spent, is really important. And an underlining again of the importance of that financial auditing and assessment of the numbers, let alone the value for money. So we're now, as a committee, we've been looking at those things in real time. The other thing, I had an early conversation with our Controller and Auditor General. We were both very clear, we didn't need to convince each other that it was important to keep an eye on how money is being spent in real time as far as possible. Obviously, audit is after the event, but we wanted to make sure that we were both in there early enough to help shape and change what government was doing in case of further problems. Well, perhaps we were prescient, I think perhaps not that prescient, to see that there would be likely further waves coming. And of course, in the UK, we're still in, for the most part, in our third lockdown, which has been extended from January. So schools only went back on the 8th of March, and most workplaces, well, most non-essential workplaces are still closed. So and today we had a session actually with the Department for Education, and still quite concerned that they don't want to do a lessons learned review. They want to back that off until it's a whole government review. And we're saying, but you've already gone through, the second lockdown of schools. Surely there are things that you can learn for this, but also the lessons about how our young people catch up. So we're now getting very much into the detail of that value for money study, the efficacy of government action, because of course we look at the economy, the efficiency and the effectiveness of government's activities. So it is really important that I think we do that in real time. It's something that I've been trying to do as chair anyway, so that we weren't leaving too long a time lag between an investigation or value for money study by our audit body and a hearing and report from our committee. And it also dampens down some of the criticism that we then get that we're a bit late in the day. But what is noticeable is that the government ministers and some of and other politicians are often choosing to cite elements of our audit, of the National Audit Office reports or indeed our reports, they'll take a line out of context or positive word by me and say that I've sanctioned something. And it's quite a slippery game. So obviously I'm calling that out at every step of the way, because I think it is a dangerous world where you have a government that is trying to spin the work of the National Audit Body. Its work stands for itself. It's very clear. It has conclusions when it has conclusions. It makes observations when there are observations. It has a commentary, but it is clear what it is a conclusion of the National Audit Body. And to spin that has been particularly unhelpful. And for me, that is a real worry. And I don't know how it is around the rest of the world at the moment. I've been talking to some of my colleagues in the Commonwealth, that to have that questioning of what we would see as a good baseline honest broker, really, an honest commentator, an actor in the world of Whitehall and Westminster, is very, very unhelpful. And it's a sign of a sort of defensiveness in government when clearly billions has gone out of the door. But I would say if I was in government now, I would be welcoming the scrutiny because of the extraordinary and powerful circumstances that ministers find themselves in, where they can, with literally the swipe of a pen, spend billions of pounds. Just to give it in context, the 37 billion pounds allocated to our test and trace system. So far, around 23 billion has been spent, obviously changing every week, but the 37 billion covers the first bit of the next financial year as well. That is bigger than most departments, well, certainly things, well, bigger than the Department for Transport's budget, for example, just to put it in context. So these are mega sums of money, and we need to be keeping a very close eye on it. And of course, I'm also conscious that at the end of the day, it's going to be taxpayers that are going to be paying it back. So we've got to watch it closely. One of the other things we haven't yet done, but partly because we've got a growth in the UK of what you might call campaigning lawyers who have been taking various companies to court for issues around things like the PPE contracts. So we haven't yet had those private sector companies in as witnesses to tell us how it was for them, partly because a number of them were under that wasn't quite sub judice, but they wouldn't really be very forthcoming if I'd called them in front of us as they were going through a court action. So come towards the end of May or June, we're just waiting for certain parliamentary dates, we'll be having the first wave of those private companies in, those who won contracts, so they will explain and justify presumably why they won them and why they think they were worth so much. Those who tried to bid and did not get very far, and those that are already had contracts before but didn't win any new ones, because we want to try and divine what it was like from their point of view. So that is a bit post hoc, but I think it's again about lessons learned about how in future pandemics we turn our own national supply chains into important supply chains for the essentials if necessary, because clearly that was the challenge here, that we all rely, most countries rely on international supply chains. So I think in terms of value for money, it is still, the jury is still out, and you could argue it's a bit like with defence. You spend a lot of money in the hope that it will never happen, but we are being robust and challenging, because if you take something that we're spending a lot of money on now, if we can, through our timely work, shine a light on whether it's actually delivering, plus you'll have the outside side aspects of it. You know, we're getting high levels of vaccines delivered now, that may well have an impact on lockdown. So there are other outside aspects to that. But if they all come together, then it may be that we can help governments stop spending money on some of the things that are not as good value in order to take some money off that over £400 billion debt so far, or indeed spend it on something more effective. One thing we would say has been pretty effective and pretty cost effective actually was the vaccine programme. So we've had our concerns around that are more about what happens next. And as we've seen with the international power play, that there is a danger of vaccine nationalism, which is unhelpful, I think, to us all, but making sure that we're building up a manufacturing base here and planning the rollout so that we can, because mass vaccine centres in sports halls and so on are not practical for the long term. So we need to have a long-term vaccine programme, and that's the thing that we'll be pushing government on, because ultimately that's going to be better value than locking down the economy every time there's a new variant or a spike, or it's just the point in the year where you have to have your now COVID vaccine alongside your flu vaccine. But that was, if you compare the amount of money spent up front, it was a gamble, but it paid off, and it got to UK early supplies. And that was quite interesting. I think it's worth highlighting this one because it brought in a mixture of scientists, people from commercial backgrounds. I think there were a very large number of registered interests conflicts of interest registered, but they were minor. We as a committee, we looked at that because obviously it's a concern to us, but we did say, well, we didn't have big concerns about that. If you work for a pharmaceutical company, you're going to have a conflict of interest if you're helping the government procure a vaccine. But it showed what can happen, a sort of an alchemy between private sector expertise, private sector understanding, and Whitehall understanding, knowledge, and taxpayers' money. And it came together. The key thing for us on that, and also we had the ventilator challenge. That actually was an interesting one when the early days when we all thought, every country, that we need more ventilators. We've got a lot that aren't going to be used now, but we've still got them. But there was an odd conflagration there of the head of procurement in central government having had a background in engineering, so he knew who to put together to manufacture ventilators. And so again, it was quite a risky gamble in some ways, but to a large extent, I mean, we still got criticisms of it, of course, but it paid off to quite a large extent. Now, how you turn those lessons into long-term lessons for Whitehall while managing, taxpayers' money and conflicts of interest, so that you're not having individuals profiting or companies profiting from the taxpayer unfairly, that's the question. And I think that's going to be really interesting to compare when we get to the point of comparison between countries across Europe and the Commonwealth and elsewhere about what works and what doesn't. And obviously in some countries it's just a different culture to begin with, but we do have a bit more of a public-private, say, divide, clearly rules about how the two interact. I mean, I think it's probably best if I leave it there. I'm really happy. We're keen, actually, Franklin, if you've got time to take questions, because I'm just sorely aware I've missed rather a lot of other people's contributions.
Thank you very much. Fascinating to hear the issues you mentioned on, for instance, the need of recording and justifying decisions also when it's going very fast. Issue of transparency and publication of contracts. Some new mechanism of the NAO that's interesting, the cost tracker, and the issue of monitoring how the money is spent in real time. And then, of course, what you will have on your plate very soon, the lessons learned and how we can compare that with other countries. So thank you very much for that. We'll have indeed time for a couple of questions. I believe there is one or two questions coming from Geoff on your presentation. So we'll take that one first, and then we might have one or two other questions as well. If we can try to keep it as short as possible, so we'll try to stay within the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franklin, and Ms. Hillier, a pleasure to meet you virtually. A couple of questions for you. As a Canadian, I think one of the things I really admire about the UK Public Accounts Committee is how parties tend to work in a non-partisan way through their questioning and collaboration to get to the bottom of things. And I think one of the criticisms I have of our PAC is that whenever an issue is overly contentious, the party lines divide pretty quickly, even in the Public Accounts Committee. We had a scandal recently in which the government tendered a large contract to an NGO, to a charity. I'm sure you've heard about it. I'm wondering, when it comes to issues like the government accounting practices, where you mentioned they were seen as fairly lax in some regards, and there were some issues. Was the committee able to keep that nonpartisan approach, or did things get a little tense?
No, we've had, actually, it's been remarkable. And with Brexit too, we produced about a dozen reports on Brexit, and the range of opinion on Brexit on my committee was broad in each party, as well as across the parties. So, we do it. But I think, it's interesting because I've been to speak to Canadian colleagues about this a few times, and we've had inbound visits too. And one of the things I really work is to forge a culture on the committee that reminds people of our constitutional position, that we are the watchdog, and we are there to do a job. And also for my members, the members who are members of the government party and other, I have to say, I communicate a lot with members across the House of all parties. Every week they get a letter from me telling them what's happening, encouraging them to tell me what's going on. And sometimes they'll send me anonymous, well, they'll tell me who they are, but they don't want their name in the frame, but they want to criticize their government, but not be seen to be doing so. So we become a safe place for that. But I spoke to a couple of the new members, and I've got some, particularly three very active new members of the government party. And said, it's great, you're doing brilliantly and you're being very helpful. And they said, well, we've been in government, because a couple of them had been special advisors. We've seen what bad looks like and we want it to be better. And I think that's a real cultural thing. But also, you know, I make sure that we just have a certain set of parameters and rules. And I've created a deputy chair role in a slightly bizarre way in the British system. I don't quite know why we never have vice chairs of committees. We don't have a ranking member approach either. So it is the longest. If I was absent for any reason, it would be typically the longest serving member who would step up just to hold the chair, but they wouldn't actually act up except for a meeting. So I created a deputy role from the government party. I've had 2 deputies now. And what the members like is they say, well, if you 2 have worked it out, we can just agree it. They don't have to have an argument. I also make sure I involve the members who've been most interested in a report. So we lead on certain subjects, and those members help write the report. And so when I say to people, look, this report's come through, the lead members have all been okay, or they've changed it with me, and people will then more or less accept that. I mean, obviously they can still change it. It is noticeable though, we have, and also we prepare as a team. I make sure, it's one of my insistences, that we get together with our audit body leads on this in a room virtually at the moment, and we hammer out what we want to do in the hearing and the subject matter. Then you'll find the points of agreement, because you're not going into a room entrenched. You're going into a room to learn, to brief up, to share your experiences and your knowledge. And we've got some very knowledgeable members, and people respect each other's professional knowledge and hard work. And that seems to forge a way through. So it isn't really that magic. It's what you do in any other organization, but just in politics, it tends to be a bit more entrenched. I know that David Christopherson was trying to implement that approach. He used to say, if you close your eyes in the British PAC, you can't tell which party people are from. But you know, there's also, there's a normal sort of people management to make sure everyone's got something out of it. What is noticeable though, not particularly on my committee, but you can tell when the Prime Minister's been to speak to his backbenchers and given a clear message, because suddenly everybody will pop up, and sometimes it comes through in the public bit of the committee, but you know, not difficult in a difficult way. They'll be talking up something. So at the moment, what is really clear is the Prime Minister's talking up the vaccine programme, which is largely a success, but we've still got a lot of detail. We don't know about how well it's going. We've got bald numbers. That's not really telling us how effective long term it's being. It's a great, I'm not knocking it, a great start, but there's been a lot less positive talk about test and trace, and it feels like one's being a bit more thrown to the wolves than the other. And test and trace is much more expensive, well, very expensive, it's true. So it's really interesting. You can certainly pick that tone up, but I think that's true of politics the world over. And I suspect WhatsApp groups, one day when someone does a PhD on a WhatsApp group and how that's influenced things, I suspect quite a lot of it comes from those routes too. Sorry, a long answer to a short question, but no, so we don't have any problems at all, but we work hard to keep maintaining that culture, that we are stronger as a united committee than if we ever had a minority report, which would undermine our impact.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
One last question, maybe for a very short answer of 1 minute. First, a question to Luca about what can parliaments do to make the work of anti-corruption agency better known to the public, and so that the public better understands the importance of the work of anti-corruption agencies. And then Meg, a similar question for you. What can Parliament and what can public accounts committees do in order for the public to know more about the work of Supreme Audit Institutions, of the National Audit Office, and for the public to better understand the importance of the work of the National Audit Office? So maybe 1 minute for Luca and then one for Meg.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Franklin. So I'll keep it short. So basically, I think there's two ways that the Parliament can really help raising the public profile of anti-corruption agencies. First one is more based in legislation. I'm a strong advocate of having a public competition for the leadership of HCA, and through that, which should be led by Parliament. So they should advertise those positions in a transparent, open way, and actually include the public in the entire process. The second thing comes much later, and that is really debating annual and other reports of the anti-corruption agencies. Again, making them as visible as possible, following up on them, making sure that the government the government is implementing either recommendations or any other policy measures brought by the anti-corruption agencies, obviously depending on the mandate and the functions of a particular anti-corruption agencies. But I see those two avenues as most actually easier to do, and it helps on anti-corruption agencies, in two different aspects of their work. Firstly, by having a real, transparent, open, and merit-based selection appointment process, and then actually more from accountability side, making sure that Parliament debates the report. Also, with that, it increases, the public accountability of anti-corruption agencies.
Great, thank you very much. Meg, a couple of words on how Parliament can help the public understand the important role of Supreme Audit institutions.
Well, yes, I think it's about making sure that we maintain its integrity. We help maintain its integrity, so it does its good work. So at the moment, I am calling out both parties, sometimes misquoting, and making sure that they understand the importance of guarding that integrity. And also, we do have twice a week in the UK, when Parliament is sitting, we hold sessions on different National Audit Office reports, as well as the other work that they do that we don't get to see, and also, of course, all the financial elements of it. So I'm actually encouraging training for members of Parliament, so that's perhaps more parliamentary, on how to read departmental accounts, and to demystify the numbers, because in the end, the maths makes the world go round. It's all politics, tax, all of this is all about numbers in the end. And I didn't do a numerical. I was a political scientist, a philosopher at university. So I've moved into that world because I realised how important it is to, and I think that's the thing, is to demystify it for politicians, but also for constituents and as well. So I make a big point of highlighting the important work of the National Audit Office personally, but through the committee as well.
Excellent. So with that, I would like to thank each of our excellent speakers today. Thank you very much, Geoff, for the marvelous presentation and the insight in the mechanics of the work of Supreme Audit institutions and your challenge to their functioning. Thank you, Luca, for the insight into the work of anti-corruption agencies, this mammoth of so many institutions in so many countries, and how we can help them perform better. And thank you very much, Meg, to give us an insight in the UK politics, and indeed to bringing accountability and the lessons learned in these times when so many things need to be decided so quickly. And on that note, indeed, we have arrived at the end of our webinar. We are running out of time, so thank you very much. Also, thank you for the many participants which have joined us today at this webinar, as well as the different other events which took place in the framework of the OECD Anti-Corruption and Integrity Forum. We hope to see you again next year in the Forum 2022, maybe in person in Paris, who knows, or otherwise see you again at another webinar. Thank you very much.